Ever since I started coloring, I've had a bit of a love-hate relationship with the HSL qualifier and HSL curves in Resolve. On one hand, I absolutely love the amount of custom control and complex adjustments they offer, but on the other hand, over time I've become more and more disappointed in how often they seem to either damage my image or introduce some form of unwanted behavior during the adjustment. For this reason, over the last couple months I've spent some time developing a tool called SmoothShift, which is built as a modern alternative to the HSL qualifier and HSL curves in Resolve. So how does SmoothShift compare? Well, I've purposely built the plugin to improve upon 4 specific design areas where I feel the native qualifier and HSL curves in Resolve fall short. First off, SmoothShift is color space aware, which means that it becomes specially tuned to give you the best possible results for your current working color space. If you're like most colorists and grade in a scene referred or a log working space, you've probably already realized that the opposite is true for Resolve's qualifier. All it takes is to try to grab a key based on saturation, and you'll quickly realize that something is terribly wrong. The vast majority of saturations you'll find in a normal real-world image all seem to live in almost the first 5% of the qualification range that Resolve gives you, which makes it unrealistic to pull any kind of key that's both smooth and actually selects what you want it to. This is of course incredibly silly as a design decision, and it's perhaps the most egregious example of a number of issues that are caused by the native qualifier not being color space aware. Second is that SmoothShift uses specialized color models chosen under the hood for each of its hue, sat, and loom adjustments in order to give the most visually pleasing and mathematically smooth results. By comparison, in Resolve, nearly everything is done within the HSL color model, which, in addition to not being a very smooth model mathematically, HSL is a bit infamous for its very video-y or additive style of saturation, which means it's often part of the reason that you see some images online end up looking like this. Or when you're just trying to shift, say, the color blue to cyan, it does something like this. And unfortunately, all of the versus curves and the qualifier and things like the saturation on the primaries tab all use HSL as their color model. So in order to improve upon this, I've designed SmoothShift to automatically use one of a number of different spherical and cylindrical models, which it decides between on the fly based on which one gives the smoothest and most visually pleasing results for your current operation. And for saturation specifically, it also gives you the power to choose which color model and operation you want by fading smoothly between them. The third thing that SmoothShift does is automatically maintain gradient smoothness while you're making your selections. This means that no matter if your current selection is covering half the hue range or just a small sliver of the highlights, you don't ever have to worry about your selection creating any hard lines or lead to tearing in your image. And because it does this automatically, that also means you're able to make your selections faster and more efficiently than with the native tool. And finally, fourth is that I've designed SmoothShift's user interface with an intuitive, speed-focused workflow in mind. In other words, I've done my best to make it as easy and natural as possible to be able to make your selections and adjustments quickly so that you can feel super comfortable and confident while using it during a live client session. So next, let's take a quick look at the UI, and then we'll get on to some practical examples and get a feel for what it's like to use it during grading. So your first 3 options in the UI are where you'll be making most of your actual adjustments to the image by shifting the hue, saturation, and luminance. The next section is where you'll make your actual qualification by selecting the custom ranges of hue, sat, and loom that you'll be adjusting. The next 2 options give you a super customized ability to adjust the type of saturation added by your sat shift slider, and you can fade between additive, spherical, and subtractive styles of saturation, as well as a fader for the operation used between gamma and gain, where gamma will prioritize affecting your lower and mid saturations, while gain means you'll have more of an effect on the high saturated values of your image. Then the Show Selection checkbox will overlay a visual aid of your current selection on the image, and checking Matte will change this visual aid to a VFX style matte, where the white areas show what you currently have selected and the black areas show what is currently excluded from the selection. Then the Clamp Incoming Negatives checkbox is really only meant to be used if you're seeing any errors in the image, and it's generally only necessary if you're applying some sort of negative offset to your image data somewhere upstream in your color pipeline. By default, it's set to off to preserve image data, but if you'd prefer to be more safe about introducing visual artifacts, then you're pretty safe checking this option, and it'll clamp all incoming negative data to pure black. The next two options allow you to modify the way the target sat and loom qualifiers behave. So in normal mode, the selection will fade based on the width setting, both above and below the target you've set. Instead, by choosing either include all above or include all below as the selection mode, the width setting will only fade out the selection on one side of the target, while the other side will remain fully selected. These settings are helpful in order to allow you to set a sort of threshold to your selections. So for example, maybe once the saturation reaches a certain value, you might want to desaturate all values beyond that level, and for that you would use the include all above sat selection mode. And finally, here's where you tell the tool what your current working space is so that it's able to work properly tuned for your current color management setup. So next, let's get straight into some examples. You've already seen a lot of how SmoothShift compares to the native tools, so now I'll just show some of my personal favorite use cases for the tool and how I like to use it on my projects. First, I'll show you how I like to add a very filmic style of saturation to a look that prioritizes saturating the darker areas of the image in order to imitate the way saturation tends to work in photochemical film. So let's get into it. With SmoothShift, it's super easy. I just set the target loom qualifier to the minimum and give a healthy width, maybe about halfway. Then we can push in some saturation and also move the style of saturation towards subtractive. And now if we toggle on and off, you can see how smooth and filmic that saturation can be. And if we want, something else I sometimes like to do here is actually limit this effect to just the skin tones. So maybe I'm liking where the rest of the image is saturation-wise, but the actor's skin tones are feeling a little dull. Then I can very easily just drop down my target hue width. And by default, the target hue is already set to the skin tone vector. So just like that, I can get a nice, super filmic saturation going just for the skin. Another super common thing that I'm using SmoothShift for is to rein in those garish, high sat, high loom sort of colors. So if I take my target sat all the way to the top and start to bring in the width, and this is an example of something you might want to use the sat selection mode for since we're defining a threshold, and we can put that at include all above. Then I can start to add a negative sat shift and also change my operation to gain to prioritize those high saturated values. If we want, we can also limit this to high luminance. And something like that is looking quite nice. So let's move on to our next image. And actually, I'm just going to go copy what we just did for the last image and apply that same thing to this one. And after a few adjustments, we've also fixed a bit of a case of Mountain Dew sunset. For this one, I'm liking how most of this image is balanced, but I feel like the skin tones are a bit off here. So all I'm going to do is just bring down my hue width, and since the target hue is already at the skin tones by default, that's really all I need as far as the selection goes. So now if I just nudge this a bit towards green, and toggle on and off, then I'm quite happy with that result, and we were able to get there with just a couple clicks. Okay, so this clip I shot in Ireland, and I want to be able to bring out some of that lush green feeling that Ireland is known for. So what I'm going to try to do here is target the hue of this grass, and then try to bring that lush feeling by pushing in some green. And I like the way that looks. Maybe I could also play around with the saturation and luminance. And yeah, I'm happy with that. And the change looks smooth, and I think it looks quite natural. Alright, so the possibilities are kind of endless as far as use cases go, so I'm just going to walk through one more, and then I'll show you how to use the tool for any other type of adjustment in Resolve, and also give an example of how to use it for a super smooth way to recover highlights from blown out windows or skies. So looking at this waterfall footage, I think I really like the deeper blues that I'm seeing in the darker areas of the waterfall here. But I'm not really liking how the highlights become a bit too purple or magenta. And so what I'd like to do here is add a sort of hue specific split toning. So in the high luminance blue only values, I could push a bit more green or cyan into that vector. And that would affect just those highlights and leaving the bluer shadows where I like it. So let's just walk down our hue width and select blue. And then by refining our loom qualifier, I can start to push some of that color towards green. And I'm really liking how that turns out. We get to keep our nice deep blue in the shadows, but we also get those pretty tealish highlights without having to affect any of the other colors. So now let's take a look at how to use SmoothShift's qualification algorithm for any other node or adjustment in Resolve. So once you've made your selection, all you have to do is enable your show selection and matte modes. Then in the node graph, you can take the RGB output of SmoothShift and connect it to the alpha input of any other node. And just like that, any adjustment I make in this new node will only be applied to the area I've qualified in my SmoothShift node. As you can imagine, this opens the door for basically an infinite number of operations you can perform with SmoothShift as your qualifier. But for now, I'm going to show you an example of one of my favorite use cases of this setup, which is to handle exposure in overblown areas of the image. So let's say in this shot, I'm liking how the exposure is looking on the subject, but what I'd really like to do is be able to bring some more detail back in the landscape outside the window here. And with Resolve, I can first try to use the gain knob or the highlights knob to achieve this. But I'm not really liking how it's still adjusting the rest of my image where I already have the exposure where I want. So instead, using SmoothShift, we're going to do the exact same thing we just did with the nodes and connect the RGB output of SmoothShift to the alpha input of another node. Then I'm going to make sure the show selection and matte modes are enabled. And now, in order to see that selection, when I have SmoothShift selected, I can simply enable Resolve's highlight mode with Shift H. Then I'll just make my selection of the upper luminance values, trying to isolate that overblown area outside the window. And once I have that selected, here's the secret sauce, if you will. I can add another serial node and use Resolve's built-in blur tool to apply a healthy amount of blur to the matte. And now in my adjustment node, when I reduce exposure, ideally using like linear gain or the exposure knob on the HDR tab, you can see how we can bring back a ton of that highlight data and in a super smooth and visually realistic way. And if I just toggle this on and off to compare where we started, that looks really, really good. Now, of course, this trick isn't going to suddenly create image data where there wasn't any. But what it will do is give you a doubly smooth way of revealing the data that was already there, but was otherwise very difficult to make use of without also messing with the balance of the rest of your image. And for that reason, I really love this trick, and I think it's a super helpful one to have up your sleeve for shot-to-shot grading. So that's all the examples I have for today. I'm excited to see what you guys are able to accomplish with this tool. And hopefully it also addresses some of the shortcomings you've personally experienced with the native Resolve tools. You can find the link to it in the description of this video, and you can also download a completely free demo that you can use to get a feel for the plugin and see for yourself how it feels as part of your workflow. Also, thanks so much to all of you who helped during the initial testing phase and made suggestions already on how to improve the plugin. And keep them coming, because as long as I keep getting good ideas on ways to improve it, I'm just going to keep updating it. So again, thanks all, and hope you enjoy.